What if sanctuary wasn't just a place, but a way of living? Welcome to the Sanctuary Network, your weekly home for conversations that awaken the heart, heal the body, and inspire the spirit. I'm your host, Mary Ellen Popyk, the creator of Spirit Fest and the Natural Wellness Expos. For 2 decades, I've been creating spaces, now creating a bold new broadcast for mind, body, and spirit, where seekers, healers, and teachers come together to share wisdom, laughter, and transformation. We've seen what happens when communities gather. People become enlivened. Now, through the Sanctuary Network, that same spirit is reaching you, wherever you are in the world. Each week, we'll sit down with thought leaders, authors, and everyday visionaries. We'll also shine a light on the grassroots voices of the sanctuary marketplace, the healers, vendors, and practitioners who make this movement thrive. This isn't just another show, it's your sanctuary, a space to pause, reflect, and reconnect with what matters most. So, take a deep breath, open your heart, and join me. Together, let's step into the sanctuary. Good evening, everyone. I am so excited to be here with our very special guest. And often we begin with current topics, what's going on in the world, and we're going to do that after 9 o'clock. We'll do that after the top of the next hour, along with our conscious business tips as well, because I just want to jump right in and introduce Dr. Raymond Moody. He is literally the pioneer of life after life. I believe he coined the term near-death experience based on his work. He's a philosopher, psychiatrist with a double Ph.D. in both of these, and also a medical doctor in his spare time. So he has done so much research about death, about life after death, about near-death experiences, and we have so much that we could talk about. Tonight's topic is going to be the language of consciousness, but I really would invite anyone to call in over the next hour, 800-930-2819, if you have any questions for Dr. Moody. So let's just jump right in. There you go. Literally, where do we? So Life After Life, your organization, is literally about the scientific and spiritual exploration of the afterlife. So in all of your experiences, the language of the afterlife or the language of the other side, what does that mean to you?
Mary Ellen, this is the crux of the question of life after death, which nobody really realizes. But the reason is, if all of the common language expressions for the idea of an afterlife are figures of speech, specific different figures of speech, and the beyond, right? Or the life after death, which is kind of oxymoronic, actually, isn't it? Right? Or self-contradictory. Or the hereafter, all of those expressions are figures of speech, and they never coalesce into an actual literal meaning.
Right.
And so in reality, as all of us think about life after death, and as we think about this concept, we seem to have an idea in our mind. We may have images of heaven, and we may have a nice feeling. But in terms of bringing this down to an actual, literally decipherable and meaningful statement, it's just not possible. And I realize this is just so counterintuitive, because, people think, well, I have a life after death, an idea of an afterlife, because I have this picture in my mind of these. But once you pin it down and try to get it, it just dissolves. And that is the real difficulty in investigating the question of life after death. And so I really got interested in this topic from my interest in language and how it works. And if you think about near-death experiences, all we have of near-death experiences is the language through which it's conveyed to us. That we listen to this story of which we all want to hear. I've heard thousands of these. I can't wait to hear the next one. And they're always very inspiring. And this pattern is people will say that when they heard the doctor say, oh my God, he's dead, or we've lost her, or words to that effect, they say their experience opens into something that no matter how educated they may be, no matter how articulate they may be, no matter how many different languages they may speak, all over the world, they say there are no words for this. This is just beyond words. It is impossible to describe or put into ordinary words. And this is the fundamental characteristic of near-death experiences that we call ineffability. The great psychologist William James talked about how what he called mystical experiences are indescribable or ineffable. There are just no words to describe it. But nonetheless, people who have these very powerful experiences, you kind of want to express it, right? When something like that happens to you. So, but they go on to say, but time stood still. There wasn't any time. And I wasn't in space. This was in some other kind of plane of existence. But they say the only way I can talk about it is I say, I went through a tunnel. I got out of my body and I went through like a passageway into this brilliant light. And I met my deceased relatives and I saw my life pass in review. Everything I'd ever done appeared before me in no time at all passed, often in the presence of this being of light who is of complete compassion and love, who helps you review this life. Some people say, I have no idea how I got back. Just one moment I was in this light, the next moment I was back in my body, no sense of transition. Some people say they were told they had to go back. It's not your time to die yet. You got to go back. And then others say that they were given a choice, that they can either continue with that experience or they could go back to the life they've been leading. Not surprisingly, not all the ones I know who given that choice chose to come back. Most commonly because they have young children left to raise, is what people used to say. Like for me, I would rather have gone into the light, but I have these children or other loved ones who I didn't want to leave behind. And when people come back, no matter what they were chasing before, whether they were chasing knowledge like me or power or fame or money or any of these other things people chase, people say that what this is all about is learning to love. That's what I've heard from people all over the world, that what this being that they meet is interested in is how they have learned to love. And they say it's kind of obvious in this review of your life because you see everything you've ever done, but you're seeing it kind of not just from your point of view, but empathically identifying with the person with whom you interact. So if you see yourself doing mean-spirited something to someone, then you feel the hurt. Or if you feel the good feelings, if you do a good thing for a person. And so this really shakes people up. I mean, now, incidentally, Mary Ellen, it doesn't make them saints. Dr. George Ritchie was the first living person I ever knew, I ever heard this from. And George was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, who had this experience when he was a recruit in the army and died of double lobar pneumonia in 1943. And years later, George was the finest person I ever knew in my life. But he said to me one time, he said, Ray, he said, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And what I kind of realized later what he was talking about was that even after this vision of love and complete compassion, it's, you still have your human nature. And the way I like to say it, George was so kind, he would never put it this blunt way, but the way I'd say it is, let's face it, it's hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person, right? And so that kind of continues, people say, right? But still, it puts them on a path. And this has now been studied all over the world. It is a very, common occurrence in medical settings, and has been uh, and the subject of many articles in medical journals and so on.
Well, and I think of the different things that people have explained when they have come back from near-death experiences. I think of things that psychic readers say that they get
Just one
from the
moment.
other
Yeah.
side.
Okay. My wife's friend is dying right now.
Oh, I'm
So
sorry.
she's gotta go to the,
Okay.
yeah, but listen, I'm all right. This has been going on for
Okay.
months.
Okay. Yeah, I told you I
It's,
prayed for your friend, and I'm very
yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
And again, it's I'm gonna go back to what we talked about earlier in just a second. So the what people have explained in the different words that they can use to explain what they experienced, and I hear psychic readers find different imagery, a sound, a sight, or a smell to explain what spirit's going to be telling them. And I'm even thinking of things like mirror gazing when we meditate and we go into that state, the messages that we get. Is it fair to say that the language of consciousness is symbolism?
I think that, first of all, to think of it in terms of the broad picture of language. Before philosophy came along, language was just language. People had never stepped back from it and studied it. But it was a process from the beginning of Greek philosophy, whereby the different Greek philosophers formulated the very basic notions that we use every day without thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
like the notion of truth and falsehood, and
Mm-hmm.
the notion of the distinction between the literal meaning and the figurative meaning. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that's but the notion of truth, for example, the notion that some things are the case independently of what anybody thinks about it,
Mm-hmm.
was formulated by a Greek philosopher named Parmenides in about 500, 500 BCE. Sensationally, as a result of his trip to the underworld.
Mm.
You see, the history of logic may sound like such a terribly boring subject, but hey, folks, there were these Greek institutions known as oracles of the dead, where
Right.
they had various techniques for evoking spirits of the dead. And a practitioner at one of these kind of institutions was named Parmenides.
Mm-hmm.
And on one of his trips down to the underworld, they thought of the underworld as the afterlife,
Mm-hmm.
right? He was abducted by a goddess who sang him a song. And this is it's obvious once you see it, but look, in a pre-literate culture where there's nobody who reads or writes, people would not understand the notion of truth,
Mm-hmm.
because the very first the first inkling that we would have the notion that some things are the case independently of what anybody thinks about it is in connection with the mental operation we know from childhood as deduction,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And we understand that first premise, if Andy is taller than Bill, first premise, right? Then the second premise, Bill is taller than Charlie. Then
Mm-hmm.
the conclusion is Andy is taller than Charlie, right? It
Right.
doesn't matter what anybody thinks, perceives, or what their religion says,
Mm-hmm.
if those are true. And that is deduction.
Mm-hmm.
And people couldn't hold the premises long enough in their head to get it together, and is when there was no writing. But once they could start writing things down, they could see the relationship. Just a minute here. If this here is this here is then no, this here is also And it took a long time to express that and to put it into words. And this big first step was Parmenides, who went to the underworld and got that information. Folks, look it up in the philosophy of history books. That happened. Now, it took about another 100 years before Plato, thinking about it, says, just a minute here. We know from Parmenides that some sentences are true, which means they are the case independently what anybody thinks about it. And he said, by the same token, these other sentences are not the case no matter what anybody thinks about it. And we'll call that falsehood. It took 100 years to go from that one, right? But yet we just accept this as something that just has always been. But no, it came here from these people who had out of body experiences, who went to the underworld and like Pythagoras and saw the afterlife. Anyway, so then Plato then said, when a statement that is true or false, that has literal meaning, that's what literal meaning is. And he says there's all these other things, figures of speech or the figurative domain of language. And they like metaphor and simile and all these, and they're kind of in the middle. But Plato said there's another important domain of language too, and that is the language that is unintelligible and meaningless, which we call nonsense. Because and people hate that word until they think in just a minute here. I'm talking about like Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear. Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies as of about 10 or 15 years ago. All right. So, and you think of Through the Looking Glass, who knows, or Alice in Wonderland, who knows, or Shel Silverstein and the Modern Kids, right? So this is a very important dimension of language. But even though it's still important in the literary side of the world, because of Aristotle was just an uptight guy. I mean, I love him to death, but he was just, this was too much for him. He had to stick with, no, like, there's nothing to nonsense. And so he knocked that out of our thinking process. But now, the complication this raises for the question of an afterlife, for people who are seriously interested in the question and want to think about whether it really is, there is one way of looking at it where you just listen. It's wonderful to listen to these near-death experience stories. I've listened to thousands. I can't wait to hear the next one. And at the same time, as Plato pointed out, even if you had a bazillion wonderful stories of near-death experiences, which he was very interested in, by the way, he said that wouldn't add up to a proof of an afterlife. What you need is some set of concepts that link the experiential narratives with the statement that there's an afterlife. And that's still the problem we're in. Because let me tell you, from 50 plus years of thinking about logic and reasoning, I can assure you that in 2025, the question of life after death is not yet a scientific question. Whatever fantasies the parapsychologists and psychical researchers, who are dear and sweet friends of mine, right? But whatever they may say about this is just not accurate. I could take you just through a very simple series of arguments to show you that the question of an afterlife is not yet a scientific question. It can be in the future. But where we can, and this goes directly back to your question, Mary Ellen, about the role of language in this whole field of spirituality. I, Raymond Moody, hereby say that I have brought about a breakthrough, a confirmable breakthrough in the genuine rational investigation of an afterlife that opens a clear conceptual pathway toward a proof of an afterlife, which has already borne fruit. All right, now let me explain. When somebody says, when Dr. Seuss, Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and Samuel Beckett and a lot of great writers have nonsense as their creative product, right? And that's the kind of thing they write. And so when I was a kid, I began to to study and classify the different types of nonsense. It seems ridiculous to say that nonsense has types because in our mind we think of nonsense as something chaotic and unformed and normless and formless, right? But
Mhm.
that's just simply not right. Because
Mhm.
listen to this. 'Twas brilliant the slithy toad stood Garen Gimble at the wave. I think you would agree that's nonsense. But
Hmm.
now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but notice it's very different,
Mhm. Mhm.
a different pattern. Now listen to this. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this count. That's nonsense too, but yet a different type.
Mhm.
Or listen to this. Hack thoroughly the if well, Zoom, how's that? That's nonsense too. Well, listen to this. And I could go on and on and on. And so there's a lot of different types of nonsense. And the fact is that even though the common sense view of nonsense is that if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language, nonsense is something down here.
Mhm.
Like a short analysis will show nope, nonsense is something up here. It's a super added level of language.
Mm.
Now, Dr. Seuss and Edward Lear, so on, they wrote nonsense deliberately. All right. And I had my system of non classifying nonsense in place by the time I was in high school. All right.
Mhm.
Now,
Mhm.
when I got into medical school, I made a startling observation, and that was that when I went around on the ward and I saw my different patients, I realized that sick patients talk nonsense too, but they don't
Really?
realize it.
Right.
Dr. Seuss realized, but the patients who are delirious or who
Mhm.
are schizophrenic or who are under severe stress or who
Mhm.
are intoxicated by mercury or even under ethylene gas, which they use for an anesthetic, will talk nonsense.
Mhm.
But this is different from the type, it's the same types of patterns. In other words, the patients who would talk nonsense deliberately, I mean, involuntarily, when
Mhm.
they would talk nonsense, when they were delirious, they talked the same types of nonsense that Dr.
Mhm.
Seuss and others wrote deliberately. See what I'm saying? That
Mhm.
nonsense is nonsense, regardless of whether it's involuntary or deliberate. But now there's an immediate intermediate case that is very important, and that is somebody can talk nonsense um, inadvertent. For example, the coach comes out and says, "You guys pair up in threes." Well, that's nonsense, right?
Right. Right.
Presumably, if you say to the class, to the coach, just a minute here, coach, pair up means twos. Because he's in a clear state of mind, he will get it, and he will shift the. All right, now that same thing happens as I have already demonstrated when people have a near death experience, when they already have these rules of thinking about nonsense in
Mhm.
place.
Mhm.
All right. And so somebody who goes into a near death experience without this logic of nonsense talks about it as a travel narrative. I got out of my body and I went through a tunnel.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
just a minute here, travel narrative doesn't have a meaning if there is no time and space and if the words aren't right.
Right. Right.
See,
And just so you know,
so
we've got about a minute and a half before we need to go to the next break.
no.
So the
So
nonsense is
anyway,
the language. It's one of the languages of the other side.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so anyway, but I can bring this to a conclusion and about, at the over the next segment, and I'll show you why you can use those facts to prove that there's life after death.
And it is very deep and very profound. And that was going to be my next question because your book that you just published the last one in 2023, Proof of Life After Life. That's what everybody wants to know is
Yeah.
Dr. Raymond Moody, who studied this for 50 years, what do you think is proof of life after life? So Sierra, let's go to break and we'll find out when we come back. Here we are. We are back with philosopher, psychiatrist, medical doctor, Dr. Raymond Moody. We're talking about life after death, and he wrote Life After Life, one of the absolute foundational books about life after death and the research that you've done over the years. Your 2023 book, Proof of Life After Life, that's what we've been discussing. How would you describe proof of life after death?
Well, I think we're on the verge of it. And also I think that I should say at the very beginning that proof of life after death will not come from parapsychology or
Mm-hmm.
psychical research, because the reality is that in 2025, near death, I mean, the question of life after death is not yet a scientific question. It is a philosophical or conceptual question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I was talking earlier about how when people have a near death experience, they say there are no words, it's impossible to describe, and
Mm-hmm.
that I it was not in time, no time passed, I was not in space, I was in some other framework. But the only way I can talk about it is to say that I got out of my body and I went through a tunnel and I met my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. I talked to a divine being. He talked to me about love, came back to my body and returned to life. That's a travel narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But the presupposition is that the word, there are no words, right?
Right.
And also that it wasn't in time or space. So think about it for a minute. What meaning does a travel narrative have
Mm-hmm.
if there's no time and space?
Mm-hmm.
But when Lincoln was president, there was a very solemn state ceremony. I forgot what was going on, but people were gathered around in a very solemn mood. And Lincoln's Park called for him to mount a horse and to lead a procession away from this scene. But right there, with all the people gathered around, Lincoln mounted the horse. But when Lincoln did, the horse picked its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup.
Mm-hmm.
So the horse was dancing around. Everybody was shocked into silence. Oh, poor Mr. Lincoln, how embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
But Lincoln just looked down at the horse and he said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. Now, if you think about it, it's nonsense to say that a horse could get on its own back by putting the hoof in the stirrup and climbing forward. But
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless, you got to admit it creates a riveting, very vivid image of
Mm-hmm.
that very motion in your mind. And people just dissolved into laughter and the tension was broken. And in science, nonsense is very important because it is a placeholder.
Mm-hmm.
Just to give one example,
Mm-hmm.
at the current time of history, the most powerful physical symptoms ever devised are the general theory of relativity
Mm-hmm.
and the quantum theory. Okay, now the difficulty is any physicist will tell you, and as Dr. Kaku at the NYU, the wonderful Discover physicist, will
Mm-hmm.
tell you, the difficulty is that when you combine the equations of these two different systems, the outcome is unintelligible nonsense. Makes no sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that we got to abandon the theories, right? In science, people hold on to the nonsense until we can figure out how to make it true.
Right.
Go back in your mind, Marielle, to the year 1915. Be a highly intelligent, well-educated person of 1915, very well informed, and listen to the following sentence. All four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. In 1915, that's unintelligible nonsense,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, add the subsequent knowledge of the role of DNA in heredity,
Mm-hmm.
gene splicing, gene editing, cloning. We
Mm-hmm.
can envision sending a probe down to the wreckage, bringing
Mm-hmm.
up the DNA of the four people.
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't happened yet as far as we know, but the scenario is intelligible.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that if you think about it, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century said, look, it makes sense in our language to say that a man survives the complete loss of memory, or
Mm-hmm.
man survived a complete change of personality. He said,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a self contradiction to say that that a man survived the annihilation of his body. Now that's the real deal, but
Mm-hmm.
because we use these figures of speech, we create this impression in our mind and these feelings and so on. But the difficulty, if you really are serious about it, is there's no literal cognitive content. Now,
Mm-hmm.
back to my thoughts about nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
Since about 1969, I've been teaching courses in logic and seminars and professional seminars on how to think about language that is unintelligible. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized, as we said just before the break, that there's different types of nonsense, and people. Dr. Seuss writes them deliberately and got sold over 600 million books doing so. And Lewis Carroll similarly, right? But
Mm-hmm.
also sometimes people stumble into nonsense inadvertently, like when the coach says, "You guys pair up in threes," and that's
Right.
nonsense. But you say the coach, but just a minute, coach, pair up means two, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he will get it. If he gets it, then he'll change his behavior. Then the third situation is involuntary nonsense. Somebody who is delirious or psychotic or intoxicated with mercury or under severe stress will talk nonsense and they don't know they're talking. And when you try to correct them, it's just, well, it's more delirium, right? When
Mm-hmm.
I went to medical school, I already had my system of nonsense and classifications into place. And I'll quickly realize that when patients talk nonsense because they're ill, the type of nonsense they talk are the same types of nonsense that
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll write deliberately. So
Mm-hmm.
nonsense is nonsense, whether it's deliberate or involuntary.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that goes back to your question about the language of transcendence that you asked
Mm-hmm.
me at the very
Mm-hmm.
beginning, right? Because the language of transcendence is not literal. It is figurative and it is nonsensical. And
Mm-hmm.
that's right. You think of the Christians with their glossolalia, right? The utterance of nonsense syllables over and over and over until you reach an ecstatic state. Or
Mm-hmm.
koans. What is the sound of one hand clap? An intentionally nonsensical question, which by trying to process it logically, the student will be tripped over into another state of consciousness beyond logic. Right
Right.
now, I knew all along that eventually somebody who'd taken my nonsense logic would have a near death experience, and I anticipated what would happen would be
Mm-hmm.
that when they tried to formulate their near death experience, as I got at them, there are no words. I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel, and there was no time, no space. They would realize that that is unintelligible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they would, just like the coach, they would change their way of articulate. Now, it's already worked once to my knowledge, and probably other times, but I'm on a different way of thinking about this now. But anyway, we already have thousands of cases of near death experiences that are described through the Aristotelian logic of literal meaning, which makes it a travel narrative. Now,
Right.
future people will see the difficulty of that way of expressing it. So they will articulate it in a new way. And by lining up and comparing these two different accounts, this gives us what astronomers call parallax. Now, it's 4.3 light years out there to Alpha Centauri. And so far, the homing pigeons they sent out there with the odometer have not gotten back.
Yeah,
So
I've mentioned that.
how did they figure out that it's 4.3? Well, by 1838, they knew from Newtonian mechanics that it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And the measurements were accurate enough that they could measure the angle to Alpha Centauri here and wait exactly 6 months and measure the angle again, and that would be a difference. Mm-hmm. Just like in your high school trigonometry, you can figure out the distance out there. Now we can do this a similar move with this new logic. Mm-hmm. And it's already happened once that this man, it's the so funniest thing, this guy, one a sweet, wonderful man who is both an accomplished and eminent sculptor, but also an eminent scientist and physicist who worked with the bell of the Bell theorem, and also incredibly knew Philo Farnsworth, the wacky Mormon kid who out plowing the field and realized that that's how to transmit television, right? Like the scanning, the going across. And so he was the guy figuring out the scanning of television. So this friend of mine, he knew them both. And and then and some years ago, he took my seminar on nonsense. And then subsequently, he had this a horrible thing, H1N1, in the hospital for 60 days, 3 cardiac arrests, lost his leg to gangrene. And coming out of the hospital, like, call me in a weak voice and tell me about his near-death experience he had during this horrible illness. But anyway, then in the midst of this, he said, and Ray, he said, his voice turned tempo, like changed energy, and said, and Ray, he said, while I was over, my mind went back to the nonsense. And he said, and I saw that what you're saying is true. You can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you can take the unintelligibility axis into account. Right. And what that means, he was saying, it's like once you can understand how to think about sentences that are unintelligible, you can combine this to like get a double view on the afterlife, like in stereoscope. So that's where we're headed with this. And so my new book, Swan Song, is finished now, and the typing's all finished. And I got 15 wonderful subscribers who paid for the enormous expense for me to have to type this endless thing, which ended up actually the final manuscript was over 1,000. I can't type because of my Asperger's syndrome. So I have to get other people to type it, but it's all written out and it's over 1,000 pages long. So finally it's all together. And this is coming out initially to my 15 subscribers in a couple of weeks. Ooh, and then I'm kind of hoping I want to limit first in January or so, I'm going to release another 100 copies, of very limited, because I want to get the reaction straight before I release this to the big. I was so totally taken aback by Life After Life. It was published in November of 1975.
50 years ago.
Yeah, wow. And I was a medical student. And so I took a month off from medical school to write it. And anyway, so in November of 1975, I was Raymond Moody, obscure medical student. Then I graduated from medical school 2 months later in January of 76. And the few days after I graduated, my a friend of mine who was into shortwave radios. You're too young to remember what that was, but you could listen to, you know, stations in Europe, you know, through.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so my friend called me up and he said the reason the night before he had been listening to a radio program in Germany, and they said that they were talking about the eminent Dr. Professor Raymond Moody.
Oh.
And I thought, you know, I went from Raymond Moody, obscure medical student, to
Mm-hmm.
months later, I'm the eminent Dr. Moody. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
it's like,
Uh,
and it freaked me out. You know, I was not surprised, not prepared for the publicity. I was, you know, but anyway,
mhm.
my point here is I'm going to be sure of how this people are going to react to this by the time I publish it next year.
So are you self-publishing?
I am at first because you know these popular publishers care, they don't care about accuracy. They want to create an impression. So
Sure.
initially, anyway, this is going to be my work. Absolutely, I've written a nice letter to my dear agent of 50 something years, Nat
Mm-hmm.
Sobel, and saying, "Look, Nat, you know, I know the popular publisher won't take this, but I'm going to do it. You know, it's got to be accurate."
And it will be your literal swan song.
Yeah.
Is that why you chose the name of the book?
Yeah, because this is my last book on the afterlife. I've got this
Mhm.
is you know, and I got some humor work I want to do. See, I used to be a comedian and I wrote humor books
You're
before
still a
life
comedian.
after life. Yeah, and so I want to get back to some humor writing.
Oh, good. Well, that I would look forward to that because you really are very funny, very entertaining.
Well,
Um,
thanks. I got to tell you about Bubbadale sometimes. It's like in Bubbadale, where I'm from, we've got, you know, Dr. Mitchell, and he has near death experiences in his patients all the time.
mhm.
They've been with me since 1966. Here recently, though, in Bubbadale, we've had a great deal of difficulty because um, our chief, our main medium here in town, Miss Petunia, Dr. Mitchell has diagnosed her with a bad case of fortune teller's dementia. So
Okay.
everybody's worried up. Yeah, she said that Dr. Mitchell said that she said Madam Petunia told him that, you know, she is having a lot of trouble lately when she had been foreseeing something, remembering who it was she had foreseen it for or when it was she had foreseen it. And she said it's gotten so bad lately that sometimes when she thinks she's seeing the future, it's really the past.
Oh.
But she was telling Dr. Mitchell that several times lately, when she's been foreseeing something, she has this strange feeling that she has foreseen it before.
Mm-hmm.
But Dr. Mitchell said, no, not to worry about that. He said it was common for fortune tellers to have a little touch of that. He said they call it deja preview.
Deja preview.
But anyway, also, you know, it's just getting so bad lately. One of her clients went over there to the Boyle things parlor the other week, and he said he went in there and that she was trying to read tea leaves with the Ouija board,
Mm-hmm.
and that Dr. Mitchell was saying it's when they start trying to read tea leaves with the Ouija board that their fortune tellers dimension and that is in the last stages. But I'm sorry, I can't stop that kind of thing. But I'm just it's yeah.
Well, something else that we were speaking about earlier, and I hope you don't mind because we're having a really good time, but you had mentioned that you are experiencing a personal loss in your life that a very dear friend
Yeah,
is crossing over. And
yes.
I and I said that there's some wisdom in somebody like you that has studied life after death and near death experience for 50 years, yet the grief is still as real as you never get used to it. It's
Yes,
still
yes. I've
very
learned a
difficult.
lot about grief from people with near death experiences, and also because I was a grief counselor for some time.
Hmm.
And people with near death experiences will say that, in a way, their knowledge that their loved ones are still alive on the other side
Right.
makes the grief even more acute. And this is why.
Mm.
Religious people who say, oh, the Bible tells me that, grandma's in heaven, so I'm not going to worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Right. That's rationalization. And a lot of people do that. They just don't want to face it. So they say, oh, the Bible this or the Bible that, or Pastor Jimmy told me this or that. And they use their religion as an excuse kind of for not grieving.
Mm-hmm.
See.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because they really don't know that there's an afterlife. They just
Mm-hmm.
they think they do. They may say they do, but it's all just like rationalization or something they've read or been told.
Mm-hmm.
But a person who has a near-death experience cannot rationalize it, because to them it's a personal experience, not a doctrine or somebody's told.
Right.
So what they tell me is that because you don't have that religious prop, you know that your grandma is all right. The trouble is you miss her.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's the real crux. So I mean, the I've just been impressed in my career as a grief counselor that society is really mixed up about what grief is. That stuff that you hear about, oh, the numbness when you hear the news, the denial, oh, it can't be my friend, and then the tearfulness and the sadness and then the anger, which is so paradoxical, all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
That's what people think of as grief. And then they bring in this fiction thing of closure, which doesn't exist. That's
Right.
just closure is a term people use so they won't have to talk about somebody
Mm-hmm.
somebody who's grieving or is feeling. And
Mm-hmm.
all of those things do happen in grief, but so do they happen when you lose your favorite, um, you know, uh, toy from childhood, right? Or
Right.
your house burns down,
Right.
that are not lost. What I think of as grief in the specific symptoms of it is the kind of thing which people come to me and they say, Dr. Moody, I must be losing my mind. And that is the herald of what I call the specific symptoms of grief, the ones people don't even think about,
Mm-hmm.
but that are such that they drive the person to come to see the doctor because they think they're mentally ill. And that's what happened all to me. Dr. Moody, I must be losing my mind. Why? Because
Uh-huh.
I know my my sister died. I know that fully. But the other day I was in the shopping mall and I saw a person in the crowd who from behind looked just like, and I knew it wasn't my sister, but I had to force myself to run through the crowd to get, turn around. Yeah, it's not her. And or or they bring like a friend of mine years ago, a family friend, a family of friends. The Uncle Willis or whoever the grandpa was had a sudden change of personality,
Mm-hmm.
and so I, what's the problem here? Well, a sudden change of personality like this in somebody this age, it's usually something organic. And so let's get a brain scan. And sure enough, it was, I forget what, but a organic condition.
Mm-hmm.
Now flash forward a few years, and the um the daughter of this man, uh, no, the husband, the wife of this man died, the matriarch,
Mm-hmm.
and the matriarch had been this snappy, mean spirited, cranky person nobody wanted to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas her daughter was the reverse. Like everybody loved this very sweet woman. All right. So
Mhm. Mhm.
then a few weeks after the death of mom,
Mhm.
the daughter starts snapping at people in the grocery store, like
Mhm.
yelling at people and so that everybody in the family go, uh-oh. It's like Raymond said that when the personality change like that, it means something. So they brought her into, and so obviously it was called taking on the characteristics of the deceased. And
Interesting.
it's an unconscious process
Uh-huh.
that when somebody dies, somebody else in the family will fill in that role. See, it's not
Mhm.
conscious,
Mhm.
but it's just but it makes people think they're going crazy. Right? So, and
Mhm.
then other ones like Fragoli syndrome, where people say that they just see a stranger on the street and they feel like, oh, and they know it's not real, but it's like they identify
Right.
the stranger as their, like a woman told me one time she was on the bus and she saw a young man with a a guitar, and she suddenly thought of that as her deceased daughter. And
Mm.
then later in the day, when she went uh, to the pharmacy, she saw the young man behind or the
Mhm.
young woman behind the counter as her daughter, knowing full well it wasn't. You know,
Right.
and then the wackiest of all of the anniversary reactions. People tend to die on the anniversary of a significant loss, very often, even when they're not aware of it. But the famous case in American history, July 4th, 1826, Thomas Jefferson in Monticello died saying, "Is it yet the fourth?" I said it was. And he said, "Doth Adams yet live?" Yeah, so he
They
got,
both died on the 4th, didn't they?
that's right. And
Yeah.
Adams saying the
Yeah.
same things. And what is that? It's,
Right.
but that is grief. The weird things are the things that bring people into that, not the shock or the numbness or,
Right. We need to go to a break again, but are you okay to stay with us? Because I want to ask another question or two about grief.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for everybody. Because this conversation is fascinating. And Sierra, take us to break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back, everybody. We are having a fascinating conversation with Dr. Raymond Moody, philosopher, psychiatrist, medical doctor, and who has spent a lifetime documenting near-death experiences and proof of life after death. So we got into this subject after talking about his new book that will be coming out, Swan Song, which will be coming out in limited release as he's waiting for the public response to it. It's just to see how I just think that's so fascinating. So I look forward to more discussions about that as well. But we were talking about grief, and you were saying how it was a misunderstood phenomenon, and there's really no such thing as closure.
Oh,
So I
wow.
think about some of the most severe types of grief, people that have lost children, people that have lost spouses that were their best friend and they were so close after decades and decades. How do you help them? How do you suggest that they go on to so that they don't feel like that sore is just right at the top of the surface all the time, so that they're not constantly in a state of grief?
Well, you're talking about an acutely grieving person or a
Yes.
chronically grieving person.
After decades, after that it
Oh,
just
yeah.
really never
Well,
goes away.
I don't know. I just really don't have a solution for it because I lost my first child to death at age 36 hours,
Aw.
which for us was 9 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
In
Mm-hmm.
1970. And
Mm-hmm.
in 1970, people didn't talk about grief. And when somebody died, a wall of silence
Mm-hmm.
went down.
Mm-hmm.
And people, kind of moved away from you because they felt it might be catching or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I, if you think of my whole being in 1970 as say about the diameter of a 50-cent piece.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That I was like about that kind of circle. Suddenly there was an eclipse, but I didn't know what happened. It's like, imagine that circle of light was just suddenly eclipsed by a black blob, all
Sure.
except for a little edge there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And now in 2025, if you ask me what that is like, I say it's the same, except that now he would be 6 years old. Now he'd been in high school. So that blackness gets more because
Mm.
at every stage there's a new loss, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But now the difference is if you take that 50-cent piece circle
Mm-hmm.
and draw about a 6-inch circle around it, see, that's the situation now. It's not that the grief has changed. I can still feel it. It's just that it occupies a lesser percentage of my own inner psychic being
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because I've grown up partly because of it. I mean, the growth, the bigger circle is partly because the stimulus created by that
Right.
grief.
Right.
Yeah.
So, in my experience, the proof of life after death is comforting in many ways, knowing that we really never die. Is that what
Yeah.
your experience has been as well?
I don't know if it's comforting or not. Because, Mary Ellen, honest to goodness, I never wished that there was an afterlife. I mean, I didn't wish not, but like I was raised in a circumstance where I was essentially isolated from religion, thanks to my wonderful father who didn't
Mm-hmm.
impose it on me.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, it's a long story, but when I went to college, my view of the afterlife was it was I didn't understand really that it was something people took seriously. I
Mm-hmm.
thought it was like a premise of a cartoon or a movie, and it was something people played with as a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew about religious people. That's always been just a big blank of understanding. I didn't know what that was about.
Mm-hmm.
But then anyway, I went to the University of Virginia and took a philosophy course. And in my philosophy course, I reading Plato's Republic was where I became aware
Mm-hmm.
not only that this man who's still a hero of mine, one of the greatest geniuses of history, thought that the question of life after death was the most important question of existence.
Mm-hmm.
And the end of this magnificent book sort of culminates in this warrior who is apparently killed on the battlefield
Mm-hmm.
and who is revived during his funeral. He just sits up and he talks about that he left his body, he went through a passageway into another world, he had his life reviewed, all of these things. So I asked Professor Hammond, what is this? And he said, yeah, these early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who had apparently died but revived spontaneously and told these stories. And Professor Hammond said that Plato took them seriously as indicators of an afterlife. But a little before him, his rough contemporary, Democritus, the philosopher, had figured out that contrary to your sense that this tabletop here is solid, Democritus realized that no, because an infinite number of points can be on a line, right? But two things can touch. So therefore, there has to be a tiniest unit, like right. And he said these are atoms, and they're little particles, and then void, right? And he said what this is, these experiences. He says even after the body appears dead, this atomic biological activity is still going on, and that accounts for these experiences when they revive. And isn't it interesting? There's only been one revision, and that's due to Lavoisier in the 18th century discovered oxygen, and then its role in respiration. So now those same people that like Democritus say, "Oh, it's the oxygen deprivation to the brain, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
fails to account for how many thousands of people have identically the same experience,
Mm-hmm.
not when they are oxygen deprived, but when they're standing there at the bedside
Mm-hmm.
of somebody else who actually does pass away. The
Mm-hmm.
bystanders say, as grandma died, I got out of my body. I went part way toward this light, and then with her, and then I came back to my body. I saw the apparitions of my dying uncles, friends,
The
and relatives.
bystanders have these experiences?
What?
The bystanders have
Oh,
these?
yes, absolutely.
Wow.
These are called shared death experiences, including, Mary Ellen, plenty of cases where the bystanders report empathically co-living the dying experience of the person who passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And for years, I thought this has to be somebody very intimately connected with them,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
Like parents who told me that, like mothers who told me that as their sons were dying, they had these, and a woman who had one of these sturgay relationships, as you call it. It's like when two people are raised together as kids and friends, and they grow up, like his neighbors and friends, that they just naturally evolve into a marriage. It's one of the hardest things to deal with from a grief situation. But
Sure.
this woman was telling me she was just raised as the childhood friend of her husband. But as he was dying, she said that his whole life just appeared around them, and they were talking about it. And then I always thought, that had to be somebody close. But a few years ago, we got this message from a real an emergency room physician who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And he said, as this guy was dying, he said, everything the guy had ever done kind of appeared around the doctor in his panorama.
Mm-hmm.
But, this is extraordinary, and people don't like to think about it because there's no easy way to
Scientific
put
proof,
this
right.
into context.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. So, and that's to me, when you can cross over the science and the spirit, that's when, that is just super
There
profound.
you go. And there's a kind of argument that's very famous in philosophy that I call logico-spiritual exercises. And if you think about the common sense view is that logic is over on one side and spirituality is way, way over on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so funny that it's ignorance of history that keeps people into that view, because the very notion of the fundamental concepts of logic, as I mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
came here from the other side, folks. That's the reality.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that some of the great important arguments of history have have blended logic with spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of argument that we need or kind of proof that we need for the afterlife. And we're on the way. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
mark my words, folks, because, and test me out. My book's going to be published in a few months here. I invite and encourage people to try to find flaws in it,
Okay.
because if my readers find a mistake in it, then I am benefited
Mm.
because I see my mistake and I get closer to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, if I rather anticipate this will happen,
Mm-hmm.
that people won't be able to find a major flaw in it,
Mm-hmm.
then we are on the verge of a whole new way of
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the afterlife. In a way, the afterlife, Mary Ellen, is coming here. Think
Mm-hmm.
about it. If you go back to 1950, near-death experiences occurred as they had throughout history, but they were extraordinarily rare, because the what was the chance that a person who came close to death was going to be revived? Not much.
Yeah.
However,
Okay.
in the 1960s,
Mm-hmm.
cardiopulmonary resuscitation Then
Yeah.
it takes off. Then there's one in every department store.
Mm-hmm.
So
That'll
in
change our
about
paradigm. Yeah.
the late 60s to the early 70s, what was once an extraordinarily rare phenomenon
Mm-hmm.
became commonplace.
Mm-hmm.
And now it happens all the time, so much so
Mm-hmm.
that I think almost every person in the United States, anyway, has to know somebody who's been to the other side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Yes, I
Yeah.
mean, you may not know that you know them because
Mm-hmm.
they may be reluctant to talk about it, but everybody does essentially know somebody. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that means that a set of nodes are created on the earth where you can talk to somebody who's in touch with, because once somebody has this experience, it never goes away, right? It's still in them.
Right. Right.
So it's like a network is forming where it's easy to talk to somebody who has had a personal experience of the
Mm-hmm.
other side.
Let's
Now
go
that's
down the rabbit
changing.
hole just a little bit further, because we touched on this earlier during the break. Philosophers have been discussing, they've been having conversations just like you and I are having right now for more than 2,000 years.
Yeah,
These same discussions of,
yeah.
is life after death? What is the meaning of life?
Mhm.
You were saying you think that in the next 100 years that our paradigm is going to shift
Yeah.
greatly once
Yes,
we.
because I've already done it. And
Mhm.
it's far, I mean, I've had a lot of people, smart people, including some of some of the nicest people I've ever met are in the intelligence community. And
Mhm.
if anybody could really realize what the CIA that I have experienced really is, it's,
Mhm.
I'd always thought of James Bond jumping out of airplanes or no, they consulted me, these very sweet people, a couple of times. And no, I can't imagine these folks jumping out of airplanes, but they are what I call nerds, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Very nice nerds with the big, thick glasses who talk like this, know everything. But, the nicest folks. And the fact that they had me back on this a couple of times. And they could have made a mistake once, but not
Mhm.
two more times. So they didn't say it in so many words, but or one of them kind of, but it's like I've come across something here that is not going to be received kindly at first by the parapsychological or
Mhm.
or um or uh, psychical research
Mhm.
wing,
Mhm.
but will eventually hold up because it's already worked.
Right. Right. So you were saying in the next 100 years that part of what is going to kind of inspire this evolution is going to be once we realize or that we know proof positive that we are not alone in the universe.
That's right. It's the a rational proof of an afterlife, to use that way of putting it, will necessarily change the human mind, and this is
Mhm.
why.
Mhm.
Um, if you look at the history of the development of this concept in Western philosophy, it was a couple of 100 years development, but it kind of got crystallized with Plato's Phaedo, which is his dialogue about the afterlife. And when the Christians got started, they had to have some statement about the afterlife, but in reality, there was not much in the Jewish and Christian scriptures to go on. So
Mhm.
they adopted Plato's Phaedo as the theology of the afterlife. It sounds counterintuitive, and a lot of so-called Christians, no, no, yeah, dang it. But you look at it like you look at the history, that's what happened.
Mhm.
And so then there went through a couple of like 1,000+ year period there, see, where you better not talk much about this.
Mhm. Mhm.
Say, because that they made that stake out there pretty permanent, right? And so
Mhm.
and so so. Um, but once things opened up a little bit, and the people came out from under the terror of that regime.
Mm-hmm.
Then free thinkers got started, and Thomas Hobbes, for example, pointed out that there's not much intelligible cognitive content to the notion of an immaterial and moral soul. What are we talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Then, if you go on a little bit, then John Locke, who had a lot to do with our Constitution and his thinking, but John Locke got to thinking about personal identity, and he said, well, he said, what our personal identity consists of our memories and our consciousness. Then the great skeptic David Hume, a couple of hundred, like 100 years later, said, when I look inside of myself, I don't see any permanent substrate. It's just the passing impression of the moment. So
Mm-hmm.
the modern psychological view that the self is an illusion,
Right.
and so we got to revise our. Man, I think that we can do this. It's like my take on the personal identity is that your personal identity is your story,
Mm-hmm. Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's your life story, which is probably why even the skeptic David Hume said, um, I think that the only kind of afterlife that like a philosophical person could entertain would be reincarnation. And
Okay.
the reason is that and that consciousness is narrative, right? Like when something new happens to you, you add that to your continuing life story. And
Right.
so we become our stories. And I think that Hume probably had it. I don't know that he said it, but since he was a historian, he understood the role of narrative in human
Right.
affairs. And so that was what
Right.
he was getting at. But
How many
we're
of
really on the verge of a whole new way of looking at this.
how many of your clients have given you proof of reincarnation?
You know, people with near death experiences do sometimes have aspect of the experience which dealt with reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
And the first ones I heard were in Georgia, and both of them were from
Mm-hmm.
Southern Baptists, right? So
Wow. Uh-huh.
this was just very, and then they do occur, but they tends to be rare.
Mm-hmm.
But what people say when there's some aspect of their near-death experiences touch on reincarnation is they may say, that they recall that something was going on before they came into this life. So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
and in Plato's like his great account of a near-death experience, the warrior there's all that same kind of aspect where goes up to the point of reincarnation, and Plato says that, and all of this is he says mythological. I mean, it's not literal, but he's saying that
Mm-hmm.
as this warrior is coming back, he says it's like you go on a journey and you come to a place where you drink of the river of forgetfulness,
Mm-hmm.
whose waters no vessel can contain, which is loss of ego boundaries. And
Right.
you forget all you know. And what Plato was saying there, which is, I think, it's very interesting, he's saying that what separates that world from this world is an event boundary.
Okay.
An event boundary is something that everybody has experienced. It's like you're sitting in your living room and you decide you want to go into the kitchen to get something. But
Mm-hmm.
as soon as you go into the kitchen, walking through the door, you forget what you
Mm-hmm.
came in for.
Uh-huh.
And that's, an event boundary.
Been there, yeah. um the Plato. We've spoken a lot about Plato. Atlantis. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, Plato made up the Atlantis story as, to read that, it's in his dialogue, the Critias. He Plato was a great propounder of stories that he thought was illustrative.
Mm-hmm.
And the great one is the cave, the allegory of the cave for people who are down there in the cave. But
Mm-hmm.
um, Atlantis was Plato's attempt at city planning. Is what it's really about. And he was trying to, and he described the ideal state in the republic, and the and with three myths. But then in the this dialogue, the Critias, was trying to describe the ideal city, like
Mm-hmm.
what a city planners would do, and also it's a kind of humorous twist to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he makes a joke in there about aposiopesis,
Mm-hmm.
right, which is the figure of speech in which you say in the movie the character is dying saying, "I buried the treasure under," right? Or the farmer holding a shotgun says, "Get off my land, stranger, or I'll."
Mm-hmm.
Or
Mm-hmm.
the guest at the wedding holds up a toast to the bride and says, "You've been such a dear friend," and trails off. Right. That figure of speech is called aposiopesis, and
Okay.
it means stopping in mid sentence and leaving the the thought
Mm-hmm.
unfinished.
Mm-hmm.
And the Critias is an aposiopesis. But the joke is that the dialogue ends just like Atlantis did, right? And so he's telling the
Mm-hmm.
story about Atlantis, and then the dialogue.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's his bizarre sense of humor. But no, it's and even but Aristotle points out that even in Plato's lifetime, the story was just so irresistible that a lot of people just believed it, despite what he's just a fiction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now it is possible that he was sort of fictionalizing um, stories had heard, folks or just folk knowledge, because about 800 years before, this island in the in the Mediterranean had blown up,
Right.
and they knew about as a traditional story,
Mm-hmm.
but he would know. Is
Okay.
Plato was just the greatest writer, and he's always fooling people. He would say because he was just
Yeah.
the greatest.
There's so many wonderful Greek philosophers, and that's why there's just so many things to chew on, to think about.
Yeah. Oh
And
my God, I have been reading Greek philosophy since I was 18 years old, constantly.
mm-hmm.
And it is the most fascinating story of history.
Mm-hmm.
If people would only realize that they can't understand how they got the logic they did, the way they think, without understanding about Hermotimus, who could get out of his body and leave his body at will in about 600 BCE, roughly.
Uh-huh.
And then he got this, the philosophers thinking about, well, there's two things, right? There's the body and there's other things. So they're different. And then, alchemy, I mean, it's the most amazing story. Plus, they participated in these evocations of the deceased. In ancient Greece, there were 5 oracles of the dead, which
Mm-hmm.
were these subterranean facilities you go down there and see and talk with your dead relatives. And
Mm-hmm.
I've recreated the procedure. I've guided hundreds of people through it.
Ah,
Other researchers have taken my research and they've replicated it. And so, if you want to read about it, there's a simple way that you can call up your dead relatives, but you better be ready for something that's hard to grasp, because you can't deny it happens, but you can't figure it out.
we are unfortunately out of time. Right. Oh, it's like tune in next time. So we need to do this again. This has been so
Yeah, this is
fascinating.
great, Mary.
Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate your presence and your being here and all of your great work. So I'm going to say goodbye, everybody. Good night, and look forward to seeing and hearing Dr. Moody again soon. Next
Yeah, and I
Wednesday.
want to say to the people, thank you so much for listening in. Just
Oh,
hope
yeah.
you got something for it.
Yeah, and then I'll give you the link and we'll have this on replay too. So
All
the
right.
next two Wednesdays are holidays, but they'll be recorded, but we will have new shows. So We'll set a date, Dr. Moody, when we can do this
All
again.
right.
Yeah, and thank you
Terrific.
everybody for listening. Thank you for spending this time with me here on the Sanctuary Network. Tune in every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern on the Transformation Network as we gather to share stories, wisdom, and practices that remind us of something essential. Sanctuary isn't just a place you go, it's a space you create in your heart, your home, and your daily life. I hope today's conversation sparked something in you, a sense of belonging, a new idea, or simply a reminder that you are not alone on this journey. If this touched you, please share it with someone who could use a little light. Together, we can grow this circle of sanctuary and inspire a ripple of healing around the world. And don't forget, the journey continues at spiritfestusa.com, thesanctuarynetwork.com, and naturalwellnessexpo.com. And of course, every week right here on Transformation Network. Until next time, may you be well, may you be inspired, and may you live fully in sanctuary.